I want to bring back NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez and Ned Price as well. Ned, one of the things that he said was the next couple of days are going to be very important. And as he lays out the deal, on one side, you have Russia that gets Crimea and the 20% of Ukraine that they currently occupy. When asked about the other side, what was in it for Ukraine, he said they're stopping the taking of the whole country. He also thought, and again, this is quoting him, I think they will accept. Do you hear a deal there that's acceptable?
Chris, let's be clear about what we just heard. It was a lot of bluster and a lot of lies. And I'm glad you started where you did, because I think one of the most pernicious lies that we just heard was this idea that President Trump is putting pressure on President Putin. President Trump is right that he is exerting a strategy of carrots and sticks. The problem is that it's all carrots for Russia and it's all sticks for Ukraine. And I say that because going back to the start of this process, you might recall, I'm sure you recall, President Zelensky's visit to that very room, the Oval Office, when he was berated by President Trump, thrown out of the White House. And after that, the administration halted security assistance. It halted the provision of intelligence information that, by the way, had a practical impact on the ground, and it cost Ukrainian lives, and it allowed Russia to carry forward its advance. On the other hand, with Russia, they are indeed using carrots. There is a prospect of sanctions relief. There's a prospect of U.S. recognition of Crimea, again, something that only a rogues gallery of countries around the world have done. There's the prospect of essentially recognizing all of the territorial gains that Russia has made since 2022. That's about 20% of Ukrainian territory. So President Trump might think this is the basis for a deal. President Putin might think this is the basis for a deal, because indeed it would be a very favorable deal for him. The problem is that this would not be a just peace. This would be, again, capitulation. This would be appeasement rather than peace, and it would do nothing but incentivize President Putin and dictators and wannabe dictators the world over to attempt to undertake the same type of territorial aggression that has cost Ukraine so much in terms of blood and treasure, and that, by the way, has cost the United States and so many of our allies and partners so much in terms of treasure that will be replicated time and again if this were to go forward.
Ned, as you well know, a lot of Democrats felt pretty good about the fact that Marco Rubio was going to be the Secretary of State. They voted for him. They voted to confirm him. You heard what he had to say. He said, listen, he's the only leader who is talking about peace. He's the only leader who is pushing for peace. Is he right about that?
Well, look, I think the nomination and ultimately the confirmation of Secretary Rubio with a unanimous vote is going to go down as a historic mistake on the part of those who voted for him. And I understand that he was a practically minded senator, but he has proven to be anything but in terms of his time in office. And just earlier this week, he railed against the deep state and pockets of radicals within the State Department, just really echoing these MAGA talking points that, frankly, I think he knows better than to repeat. And I think even more concerningly, he is really embracing President Trump's substantive positions on issues that he would have rejected 3 months ago, certainly 3 years ago, on issues like Crimea. And in fact, his own State Department's website, as of about 3 hours ago, states very clearly that Crimea belongs to Ukraine and the United States will never, never recognize otherwise. And yet you see Secretary Rubio on the couch in the Oval Office really seconding everything the president has said. Again, we all want to see this war come to an end. It is a question of when it comes to an end, but it's also a question of how it comes to an end. And Senator Rubio would have known that a peace deal that provides Russia everything it wanted and deprived Ukraine of everything it needs and everything it has is not a recipe for peace. It's a recipe for further aggression. And he would have understood the fact that it represented that for President Putin of Russia, but also people like President Xi of China, who would see that as a green light to move forward with their most ambitious territorial acquisitions that in some cases they've harbored for years on end.
And Gabe, we know that these latest attacks from Russia on Ukraine that killed 12 people angered or at least upset President Trump. We saw it in his Twitter where he said, Vladimir, stop. Also asked about it, he said, you have no idea what pressure I'm putting on Russia. Traditional pressure might be something like sanctions, but any insight in Donald Trump's administration about what that pressure is or looks like?
Well, Chris, I want to go back to something you just zeroed in on, and you're right to really focus on this headline with Donald Trump speaking about what concessions Russia should make, what you were discussing with Ned. Chris, about back in February during when India's prime minister visited the White House, I asked the president back then, what should Russia give up? Back then, he didn't give a direct answer, and he really hasn't thus far. So I do think it is very significant that he is now pointing to this idea that the concession on the part of Russia would be simply to stop the war and not take any territory. That is very significant given the context of the last couple of days with President Zelensky basically saying that it's a non-starter. They will not recognize the territory that Russia seized illegally in Crimea. That won't work. And from being in Ukraine, I can tell you, many Ukrainians say that that just will not happen. Now, the president somehow seems to think that any peace deal that would have to involve the recognition of Crimea, if not perhaps in Ukraine, perhaps the United States. But there are a lot of questions about how he's going to get to yes from both sides here. You mentioned the president did say he was not happy with the attacks overnight, that Russia that were underway in Kyiv overnight on behalf of Russia. And you heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that that wasn't going in the right direction. But as you were speaking about with Ned, at this point, it is hard to see exactly what pressure President Trump is placing on Vladimir Putin. At least publicly, we just haven't seen it other than some social media posts, Chris.
Gabe Gutierrez and Ned Price, gentlemen, thank you.